Hey class, it's Miss Jump once again for another lesson, and today we're going to talk about women and minorities during World War II. And before I get into this more, I want to preface this lesson by saying that this is not all of the minority groups that contributed to World War II. There are so many of them, and if we really wanted to dig into it, it would probably take an entire semester. But I picked 4 that I think not only interest you as individuals, but I think has the greatest importance with World War II. First, we're going to begin with African Americans. Now, I know it's been a while, but we just recently ended our unit over the Civil Rights Movement. And I wanted to remind you guys that the Civil Rights Movement actually happens after World War II. We had flipped the 2 units so that way we can talk about the civil rights during Black History Month. Everything that they want during the Civil Rights Movement is still being fought here during World War II. So the United States was fighting in the name of democracy against Nazi Germany, which embraced an extreme form of racism based on the idea of Aryan supremacy. Yet racism was still a powerful force in American society, and no one was more keenly aware of this contradiction than African Americans. After all, their participation in World War I had not helped their struggle against racism at home. As one Black newspaper, the Chicago Defender, asked, "Why die for democracy for some foreign country when we don't have it here?" Other Black leaders called for a battle against racism on 2 fronts. They wanted all citizens to join the fight for double victory, a victory for democracy both at home and abroad. This double V campaign forced many white Americans to rethink their attitudes toward African Americans. And if you look here on the image that you have in front of you, this is a very common advertisement that you see in a lot of Black newspapers. It actually went into some white newspapers as well. But it basically is reminding people, like, yes, we're going to sign up for the military and we're going to fight because we love democracy and we support American democracy. But at the same time, we can also sign up and fight so that way people at home can take us seriously and understand that we are as strong as them. And we are as brave as them, and we can make those same sacrifices. And hopefully, if we can prove to them that we will die for you, they will give us rights. When we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of the ideas really came from African Americans' participation in World War II. With the establishment of the draft in 1940, thousands of African Americans lined up to join armed forces. By the war's end, more than 1 million had served. They faced many hardships, beginning with their segregation in training camps. They ate in separate mess halls from the white troops and slept in separate barracks. Camps that had a single movie theater even made Black trainees sit together in the last row. In the early build-up to the war, the Marines and the Army Air Corps refused to take in any African Americans. The Navy limited African American duties to cooking, cleaning rooms, and shining shoes. One such messman aboard the USS Philadelphia sent a letter to a newspaper hoping to discourage other Black men from joining the Navy. All they would become, he wrote, is seagoing bellhops, chambermaids, and dishwashers. The Army accepted Black GIs, but it excluded them from combat. The GIs served in segregated units led by white officers, often working in construction, supply, or other service groups. Now, as you see here, this should be something that's quite common to you. You have a sign from one of the camps. It's an Army camp. And you can see that the showers were segregated between colored officers and white officers. And unfortunately, this didn't really change for a while. Black leaders pressed government to end military discrimination. In time, the armed forces gave more Black soldiers the opportunity to engage in combat and become officers. The Army Air Corps established its first Black combat unit in 1941, known as the Tuskegee Airmen. These pilots and their support crews showed that African Americans could handle the most demanding assignments. They served mainly as bomber escorts, engaging in direct combat with German fighter planes. The Tuskegee Airmen gained a reputation for skill and courage, shooting some 400 German attackers out of the sky. They were the only fighter group never to lose a bomber to enemy planes during World War II. Black leaders were also working to improve conditions at home. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph, the White House, the government had done little to end discrimination in defense-related jobs. One steelmaker expressed the attitude of many in the defense industry when he said that we have not had a Negro worker in over 25 years and we do not plan to start now. Roosevelt sympathized with Black Americans, but the war in Europe had kept him from paying much attention to civil rights until Randolph's visit. Randolph focused Roosevelt's attention by threatening to lead a massive march on Washington to protest discrimination. He promised that unless Roosevelt acted, tens of thousands of African Americans would swarm into the nation's capital on July 1st. The threat worked, and on June 25, 1941, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, outlawing discrimination by defense contractors. This executive order helped pave the way for nearly 1 million African Americans to work for defense industries during the war. It also triggered a migration of African Americans out of the rural South and into the industrial cities of the North and West. From 1940 to 1945, some 500,000 Black Americans attracted by higher-paying jobs left the South. In the process, they escaped Jim Crow laws and legalized segregation that kept many of them from voting. In the cities, however, Black Americans faced other hardships, including a lack of housing and social services, as well as ongoing racial discrimination. So it's really kind of neat if you look at just like the population of African Americans in the United States. A lot of them are still urban, right? A lot of them live near cities, at the very least. This is where it stems from, is the fact that a lot of them were leaving the South during the Jim Crow South and going up to northern cities in hopes of finding jobs. So they faced a lot of white backlash. Race riots broke out in many cities across the country as Black migrants competed with white residences for housing and jobs. One of the worst riots occurred in Detroit, Michigan in the summer of 1943. A fistfight and other minor incidences ballooned into widespread conflict. Mobs of rioters burned automobiles, looted stores, and engaged in bloody battles in the streets. The riots resulted in the deaths of 25 Blacks and 9, and CORE believes in confronting discrimination through nonviolent protests. Its efforts, along with African American. Now, what I find quite interesting is Cincinnati has had its own history of race riots. And Cincinnati had a it's just interesting that every time we have some sort of cultural change of African Americans leaving the South and going north, or innocent people. Now, the Urban League and the NAACP did not want to undermine the war effort, so they avoided making any sort of demands that would anger the white people in cities even more. Another organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, took a tougher stance, and they were founded in 1942. The work of the NAACP and set the stage for the post-war civil rights movement. So, like I said, a lot of the stuff that's happening here in World War II really leads into what we see in the civil rights movement. So now we're going to look into Japanese Americans. When the attack in Pearl Harbor occurred, there were about 150,000 Japanese Americans living in the Hawaiian Islands. Some people questioned their loyalty, even accusing them of helping plan the surprise attack. Fearing sabotage, the War Department recommended a mass evacuation of Japanese Americans from Hawaii. But the American military governor of Hawaii urged everyone to stay calm. Businesses on the island opposed evacuation. They noted that losing so many workers would ruin the island's economy. The press backed the position and worked hard to keep false rumors from circulating. In the end, nearly all of the Japanese Americans in Hawaii stayed there. So people were obviously really scared after Pearl Harbor, and they didn't know who was the enemy, and they kind of took that fear and that discrimination that they saw during Pearl Harbor and put it on to the Japanese Americans. Now we're going to look into dealing with the fear. Now on the mainland, concerns about disloyalty extended to people of German and Italian ancestry. They were seen as potential collaborators, or people who work with enemy to undermine a nation's security. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed a proclamation declaring all German, Italian, and Japanese nationals or non-U.S. citizens to be enemy aliens. These orders affected more than 340,000 people of German ancestry, 690,000 people of Italian ancestry, and 47,000 people of Japanese ancestry. All enemy aliens had to register with the government and carry special identification cards. They had to turn in all firearms and cameras, as well as shortwave radios, which might be used to send information to the enemy. They also needed a travel permit to go more than 5 miles from their homes. Government officials considered putting all of the enemy aliens into camps. However, the task of relocating all German and Italian aliens posed huge problems. Also, politically influential groups of German Americans and Italian Americans resisted such a measure. The government did round up several thousand Germans and Italian aliens and sent them to internment camps in the middle of the country. An internment camp is a center for confining people who have been relocated for reasons of national security. So again, they have this fear of anyone who could be potentially working for the enemy. And this poster here was something that you would see on government buildings and stores. This discrimination did not just go toward Japanese Americans, but as I mentioned, it also went toward Italians and Germans as well. And it says here, don't speak the enemy's language. The 4 freedoms are not in their vocabulary. Speak American. Which to me is really funny because first off, America is not the only country in the world that speaks English. England, where the word English comes from, speaks English as well. So why is it specifically speaking American? And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that they were saying you are not American unless you speak the language of America. It's just very interesting to see this discrimination occurring. What was happening in Germany, Jews being told that they're not actually German citizens, that they are restricted in movement, they have to have identification cards. That stuff was happening in the United States too. Now, not at the same extent, we weren't sending them to concentration camps to work them to death, but we were also, as you'll see in a minute, sending them to a camp. The people of Japanese ancestry, in contrast, were a much smaller group with much less political power. They faced more racial discrimination than the people of German or Italian ancestry because they were of non-white, non-European ancestry. Their social isolationism also worked against them. They had not assimilated into American culture as well as other immigrant groups had. They kept largely to themselves in ethnic communities outside of the American mainstream. In addition, they lived mainly on the West Coast, where the fear of Japanese invasion was strongest. Unlike in Hawaii, the mainland press whipped up the fear of accusing Japanese Americans of spying or being more loyal to Japan than the United States. All of these factors made it easier for the government to act against the people of the Japanese ancestry. In February of 1942, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. This order declared that large military zones would be set up to exclude current residents who are believed to be a threat to security. In March of 1942, the military used this executive order to launch a mass evacuation of people of Japanese ancestry from the Pacific coast. Evacuees had just a few weeks to sell their homes and all of their possessions. The order to move out and stay out applied not only to Japanese enemy aliens, but also to Japanese American citizens. Of the 127,000 people of Japanese ancestry living in the mainland United States, 80,000 were native-born American citizens. As such, they were entitled to the same constitutional rights as all citizens. This was the main argument made by a Japanese American named Fred Kawamatsu, who did not obey the order because it would mean leaving his non-Japanese girlfriend. After 2 months, Kawamatsu was arrested and convicted, with remaining in a restricted military area. Kawamatsu appealed the verdict all the way to the Supreme Court. In the case Kawamatsu versus the United States, that a group's civil rights can be set aside in a time of war. 3 of the 9 judges dissented from the opinion, including Justice Robert H. Jackson. He expressed his fear that the court of the time has validated the principle of racial discrimination in criminal procedure and of transplanting American citizens. So I kind of have this picture side by side because I want you to kind of think about Americans during World War II. I decided to kind of compare what was happening in Germany with what was happening in the United States. Now, I don't want to say that what we were doing to the Japanese was on par with what the Germans were doing to the Jews. That's not true. But you have this whole idea of America fighting for democracy and a freedom, and then we take thousands upon thousands of people of Japanese descent, regardless of their citizenship, into these internment camps. To me, it's just a little hypocritical. So as early as 1942, while the camps were still filling up, the government realized that the threat of the West Coast invasion had passed, and officials began allowing certain groups of Japanese Americans to leave the camps. And these included about 10,000 farmers and about 4,300 college students. Starting in 1943, thousands of young men left the camps to join the army, and most of them served in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This all-volunteer Japanese-American unit became famous for its bravery in battle. In fact, it earned more medals than any other unit of its size in American history. In 1944, the government began letting the remaining internees return to the West Coast, and within the next year, they were free to leave the camps. And you're actually going to be talking about this 442nd Combat Regiment with your assignment today. So after Pearl Harbor in 1941, America joins the war. And immediately, once we joined the war, we were at war with all of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. The thing about Japan specifically is that they have been, in this entire war, very good at cracking codes, communication codes. So before I move on, I want to talk about what a code is. A code is a secret message that you write. So a lot of spies use codes. Sometimes it's a number represents a letter in the alphabet. Sometimes it's pictures. But the Japanese military was so good at cracking codes. And every single time that we would have some type of a battle, if we would have an attack that we were planning against them or against somebody in the Axis powers, both in the Pacific theater, in the islands near Japan, and also in Europe, they would somehow find out what our plans were. They crack the code and they would be there waiting for us. So there was an issue with trying to find a way to communicate with the rest of the military without Japan knowing what they were saying. So as I said, the Japanese were superior when it comes to code breaking. They had an entire unit that was an organization that specifically dealt with breaking of codes. And if you look into Japanese history, coding has always been kind of important to them. And it's been something that they've held really tight, and they're very proud of their superiority in it. The problem is we can't necessarily fight in a war which we can't communicate with. Or when we do communicate, the Japanese knows exactly what we're about to do before we even do it. In comes this guy. His name is Philip Johnson. And Philip Johnson actually fought in World War I. By the time World War II began, he was too old to fight, but he was still working within the military, so he wasn't in combat, but he was working kind of behind the scenes. And Philip Johnson had lived in the Navajo reservation from the age of 4. And when he grew up, he learned the Navajo language and he spoke with his friends in Navajo. The thing about the Navajo language that's really important to know is that it is not a language that is written down. And it doesn't even have an alphabet. It's entirely a vocal language. So when he saw that there was this problem with codes and there was this problem of Japan cracking the codes, he knew that the Navajo language might be a secret tool that America has. So he goes up and he talks to the Marines and he tells the Marines, look, I know this, I don't really know at this point, he's kind of forgotten a lot of the language, but he's like, the Navajo language is something that I spoke when I was a child and it doesn't have written language. Very few people in the United States speak it because it is a native language. And those who do speak it, they're not going out in the world and teaching the language. So it's one language that we can kind of use as a tool to speak and send messages to one another in the war. And the Marines decided, sure, we'll try it out. And they originally recruited 30 men from the Navajo reservation. And they were so efficient. So they went through basic training. They were sent to a special training force where their job was to devise a new Marine code book, which includes what each syllable that they say is and what it means. Once they can do that, they will be sent and use it in combat. And eventually they were so efficient at this, and they made the code book and it worked wonderfully. And they were so efficient at this that by the end of the year in 1942, the Marines had recruited an additional 80. And by August of 1943, over 200 Navajo speakers were recruited into the U.S. Marines and were used in combat zones for communication. And the Japanese military were never able to crack it. They could not translate it. The Navajo code talkers served in all 6 Marine units during World War II. So every battle that we're going to be talking about in the next couple of weeks, like Iwo Jima, anything that happens in the Pacific Ocean, and the Navajo code talkers were there as communicators. So a lot of the successes that we see in the Pacific was due to these Native Americans. And here's another picture of some of the other code talkers that were created into the U.S. military. One thing that's sort of interesting to me is when they returned home, they were not allowed to talk about it. No one knew that they were used as communicators during World War II until the 1960s, when the government finally released that information to the public. And since then, they have really had a lack of recognition simply because they were a secret division. And it's nice, I guess, now that you can see their work being recognized in the history books. So the code talkers and the Navajos were extremely amazing at helping us with the communication abroad, simply because they were able to use their native language and their native tongue, that the Japanese generals in Japan fighting against us in the Pacific had no clue what they were saying the entire war. So now let's talk about women. So in early 1942, a popular song was released called Rosie the Riveter, and it captured the spirit of the home front. And it talks about women working all day, rain or shine, making sure that everything is good for the assembly line. I might actually have you listen to this for a bell ringer one day. But after hearing the song, one of the country's most popular artists, Norman Rockwell, put on his own version of Rosie on the cover of the magazine, which you see in the middle of the slide here. And he was an author for the Saturday Evening Post. And immediately, 2 movies followed that showcased Rosie the Riveter, made her into a figure that people watched and enjoyed. The fictional Rosie the Riveter came to represent all of the real women who worked to support the war effort. And most people, when they think of Rosie the Riveter, they think of the poster that you see on the left, of the woman kind of holding up, showing off her muscles. That is another poster, a propaganda poster that was created a little bit later in the war, that was based on the original from Norman Rockwell. The demand for workers skyrocketed during the war as men left their jobs to serve in the armed forces. At first, industry hired unemployed men to fill those jobs. But as war production soared, businesses and governments started to recruit women, using slogans such as, "The more women work, the sooner we win." About 18 million women took jobs outside of the home during the war, up from 12 million before the war. Most women continued to work in occupations that were traditionally female, such as service, clerical, and sales work. Many women, however, took positions held traditionally by men, and they became welders, mechanics, and lumberjacks, as well as lawyers, scientists, and architects. Not everything about the workplace pleased women, though. They often faced hostility in the job, especially in male-dominated industries. African American women faced the added stress of racial hostility. Another issue was that women's wages did not increase as much as men's pay. And in 1942, the NWLB ruled that women should get equal pay for work of the same quality and quantity. However, businesses often ignored the rule. Even labor unions, whose female membership soared during the war, rarely challenged unfair wage rates. So this picture here is actually of 2 women working on metal, and they're actually making the metal that would be used to put on planes. So they're building planes. A lot of women's contribution in the war had to do with really getting everything prepared for the war, sending the goods and services like planes across the seas to be used by men. Every man that could work these jobs was signing up to fight in the war, and they couldn't reach the production they needed, so they started hiring women. And what is really important to also note is that this is the first time in which a lot of women were interacting with members of the community that is not a part of their community. In this picture, you see 2 people. One of them is African American. The one on the left is African American, and the one on the right is white. And this wasn't very common at the time, but it did happen. And for the first time, you see white women communicating and, talking with Black women. This becomes really important when we get in the Civil Rights Movement, because a lot of the white women that supported the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of that support they had came from working side by side with them during World War II. Soon after the war started, military leaders realized that women could do much of the clerical and secretarial work done by male soldiers, freeing up the space for men to go fight. Congress agreed, and in 1942 it passed legislation creating a civilian support unit for the Army known as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. On the first day of registration, more than 13,000 women volunteered to serve this unit. The following year, the unit was granted military status and was renamed the Women's Army Corps WAC, or WAC. Women in WWII became members of the military and underwent rigorous army training. If the guys can take it, one volunteer remarked, so can I. Women in the armed forces quickly moved beyond clerical work into jobs such as truck driver, mechanic, radio operator, air traffic controller, and parachute rigger. A select few became pilots, mainly to ferry aircraft from factories to bases. Only WWICs, however, served on the battlefield, working behind the lines in various supporting roles, including nursing. More than 200 American women died overseas as the result of enemy action. So what you are going to do for your assignment today is you're going to look deeper into the 4 minority groups that we discussed today. African Americans, Japanese Americans, Native Americans, and women. I have an assignment that just has you can either watch a video that talks about the code talkers or talks about each of the 4 minority groups, or you can read the website. The directions are pretty straightforward, but if you're having any problems with the links, let me know and I can take care of them. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the week, and next week is spring break, so I hope you have plans to Netflix and binge next week. And until after spring break, I might not see you again until after spring break, so you have a wonderful day and you stay safe, and see you later.